Hello everyone and welcome. Clearly different people will use different weapons and armors depending on the period of history and the region they are in. Now one very clear example of that is the Lamellar armor, because Lamellar armor was used a lot in Asia and Eastern Europe, but was actually very rare, basically non-existent in Western Europe. So the question is, why was that the case? Why was it so common in the East and basically non-existent in the West? Let's find out. So before we find out why it wasn't so common in the West, first of all we need to find out what even a Lamellar is, and also what are its disadvantages and advantages, because that's going to help us tremendously to understand why it was used in the East primarily. So first of all, what is a Lamellar armor? Now remember that there will be differences between different sorts of Lamellar armors, all in the material used for the plates, the material used to lace the plates together, the exact shape and design of the general armor, how the plates overlap, and so on. There will be tons of differences because Lamellar armor has been used in an incredibly long amount of time. So it was used in like the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and was even used all the way up to the early 1900s by the Japanese, mainly for like ceremonial purposes and stuff like that, not really for fighting, but it was still used until very recently. So it has been used in an incredibly long amount of time, so clearly there will be differences, and also in an incredibly large region of the world, basically the entirety of all of Asia and Eastern Europe. So there are going to be lots of differences between the exact Lamellar armor. Now a Lamellar armor is very similar to armors like the scale armor, the laminated, or the brigandine, in the sense that it is made up of small scales. So these small plates here are going to be attached together to form up different rows, and the rows are going to be attached together to form up larger plates that you're going to use armor. So the key difference between a Lamellar armor and a scale armor, for example, is the fact that the scale armor is attached on a backing. So each individual plate will be attached on that backing, and you'll basically fill up that entire backing with scales. A Lamellar armor is very different because it does not have a backing. Instead, the plates are attached together, and that is what holds the plate together, not a backing. So you'll basically have all of these different rows that you'll form up with these plates. Now, a lot of similar sorts of armors will have these rows. Let's take, for example, the scale armor. The scale armor kind of forms up these rows, and then you'll have another row overlapping that, another row overlapping that, and so on. Now, on a scale armor, the plates within a certain row will not overlap. They will just sit side by side to form a row. On the Lamellar, it's a little bit different. On the Lamellar, each plate within a certain row will actually overlap another plate within that row. So if we take this row here, for example, you can see that the left plate is overlapping over the right plate, the whole length of the row. And then on the row above, it's actually the right plate overlapping the left plate. Now this will change depending on the exact Lamellar armor you have. On this particular one, the way the plates overlap within a certain row switches between the rows. So it's going to be right, left, and so on. This can depend on the exact armor. You can have an armor on which all the right plates are going to overlap over the left plate, and you can have some armors similar to this one, where, as you can see, the middle plate is the outer plate, and then the other plates will overlap underneath that one middle plate. So it kind of switches overlapping direction in the middle of the row. This will depend on the exact Lamellar armor you're talking about, but generally speaking, there is going to be a certain overlap within that certain row, which is not the case on something like a scale armor. And then obviously you have the individual rows overlapping another row. Now, usually on a Lamellar, the bottom row will overlap over the top row. So if you see here, this bottom row here is the exterior row, and it's overlapping over this one, which is itself overlapping over this one, and over this one, and over this one, and so on. And this is quite unusual. Usually if you have something like a scale armor, the top scale is going to overlap over the bottom scale, which is going to overlap over the one that's below it, and so on. It's actually the opposite on a lamellar armor. And this is because when you're building a scale armor, you'll start by attaching the bottom scales, and then you'll attach scales on top of them and just progress all the way up. On a lamellar, you're starting by building it from the top. So the first row that was built on this armor was this top row right here. And then you'll build downwards like this. And the good thing about this is that it creates a very modular armor, meaning that it's actually very easy to just remove this bottom row if, for example, the armor is too large, or add another row on top of that if the armor is too small. Because you can basically attach another row on the exterior of this, you don't need to have the trouble to need to put the plate underneath to make the top row overlap on over the one at the bottom. So it is, generally speaking, more practical. Now, you do have some lamellar armors that are going to have the top row overlapping over the bottom row. It does exist, but it's just not the most common, and usually the bottom row will overlap over the top row. Now, unlike other armors like the Brigandine, for example, the lamellar is not using any rivets to being assembled. Instead, it's using a lace. So you'll basically have a cord that you just put through all of the holes of these plates, and that lace is going to attach everything together. And this lace can really be made out of basically any material that's flexible enough. The exact material will really depend on what culture you're talking about. For example, in Japan, usually they used silk, so silk cords, because that's really cut resistant, and the Mongols would usually use something like rawhide or leather instead. So it depends on the exact region you're talking about, but usually it's going to be some sort of organic material that is flexible enough to be laced through the plates. Then we have the plates themselves, which can also be made out of all sorts of different materials. So this particular one is made of steel. This one, which is just a piece that I have been trying to experiment with, is made of leather, but you can also use something like rawhide or something like that, or even bronze. Bronze was very common in like the early Iron Age. So you can really use anything to make a lamellar armor. And in terms of the shape of the armor, the shape will just vary a whole lot between the region, the use you want of it. Lamellar can basically protect the entire body if you absolutely wanted to. You can have leg protection made of lamellar. You can even make advent tails out of lamellar. It was done. Now, usually when you make an advent tail for a helmet out of lamellar, the different rows are going to be laced together very loosely, so you can actually bend your head to the sides. But really, you can make a lot of different armor pieces out of lamellar. So now let's start talking about the disadvantages of the lamellar, because it does have a lot of disadvantages, even though it is a pretty good armor. And the first of those disadvantages is the fact that the lacing on the lamellar, which is what connects everything together, is very vulnerable. Because as you can see, you have all of these exposed leather cords that can be cut, that can rot, and with time will end up break by themselves because of the movement of the plates. Now, this will take some time, and cutting them with like a sword or something like that is not too easy, because you are, generally speaking, talking about quite a tough material, and even if you do cut some of them, the whole armor is not going to fall apart, because you're not going to be able to cut all the laces of an entire row. But it can become a problem that some of them get cut, and with time, with marching and stuff like that, the armor is going to end up falling apart. And you have the fact that the laces can rot and are going to break apart after some time. Now, very often these armor would be relaced, so basically just replace all the laces of the armor, and that was part of the maintenance. Now, the good thing is that relacing a lamellar is actually very easy. So if you take this piece here, this is a piece of lamellar that I made just to experiment, and it is incredibly easy to lace everything together. It's just incredibly easy because you're just talking about a lace that you're just lacing through, and it's incredibly easy. You basically don't need any tools except like a knife to cut it when you're done with a row, but that's about it. The next problem is that it is very hard to remove rust from a lamellar. Usually, if you have a smooth plate, you can basically just take some sandpaper and just scrub off the rust. That is very easy. The problem with a Lamellar is that you have all of these leather cords. And if you try to scrub sandpaper over the armor, you're actually going to destroy those leather cords. So clearly you cannot do that so easily. So preventing the armor from rusting is much harder. And not only that, but the lasers, no matter the material they are made of, are going to absorb and retain a certain amount of humidity that is going to help the armor rust. So that is a real problem with a Lamellar. And as you can see, this one is a little bit rusty in some places, simply because I can basically not do anything to prevent it from rusting except like oiling it. That's the best I can do. But once it has started rusting, there is very little you can do to it except like dismantling everything, sanding every single plate, and then putting it back together, which is possible, but it takes some time. The next main problem, because of course there are like small problems, but the next main problem is the fact that it has a lot of gaps. So on this armor you can see it is quite short, it's not protecting the side, it's not protecting the armpits, anything like that. It has a lot of gaps and cannot protect those gaps as easily as something like the mail armor. And that is simply because it is stiffer than a mail armor. It's not completely stiff, like you still have some good flexing in it, but it's not flexible enough to be used to protect those gaps. Now obviously you can try to cover them up in some kind of way. I could like put a plate in front of here, something like that, but it's just not as easy as with mail. Now let's talk a little bit about the advantages of the Lamellar armor, because clearly it has some advantages. And the first and probably most important of those advantages is the fact that it is harder to pierce for any kind of weapon than some armors like mail. Now obviously mail is hard to pierce for most weapons, especially basically all weapons until like the end of the Viking Age, but bows, heavy war bows, can still pierce mail with relative ease. However, it is way harder for them to pierce a Lamellar armor because Lamellar armor is made out of plates. So especially against those arrows, a Lamellar is actually going to be more protective. On top of that, the Lamellar armor is also more protective against blunt force because it is more stiff. So if I get hit by like a big 200 axe or something like that, the Lamellar armor is going to protect me more than a mail armor. Now obviously it's not going to protect as much as something like a solid plate, but this is also more flexible than a solid plate and more comfortable to wear. It also has a bit of a better weight distribution on the body than mail armor, because mail armor is so flexible that it will basically hang on the shoulders and on your belt. The Lamellar armor will have most of its weight on your shoulders, but it will also have some of that weight on the side here because you're attaching it tightly on the side. So the weight distribution is, generally speaking, a little bit better on the Lamellar. And on top of that, a Lamellar is also much more modular, meaning that it is very easy for me to change the size of this Lamellar armor. For example, if I am like very short and loot the armor from a very tall person, I can actually just change the size and actually just remove a row to make it fit me. And the same way, if I am very tall and loot the armor from a very short person, I can actually just get some extra plates and actually attach another row on the bottom to just make it a little bit longer. So you can really easily, and that is partly because of the lacing system, which is incredibly easy to just remove and reattach. It is incredibly easy to resize to any person, or resize to make like horse armor or something like that. Incredibly easy to do. If I want to do that with something like a scale armor, for example, I would have the problem that the scale armor cannot be larger than its backing. So I cannot start attaching plates on the outside of the backing because they have nowhere to be attached. So I'm kind of limited by their backing, and I kind of have to remake the whole armor and just scrap that entire backing. If I want to resize it to Lamellar, I'm just going to add another row. That's not any sort of problem. The next big advantage is that the Lamellar armor can be made of basically anything. So clearly you have steel, you have bronze, but you can also make it out of leather, out of rawhide. Most things can be used to make a Lamellar. Mail armor, for example, well, clearly you can make it out of steel and iron. You could probably make it out of bronze, but you cannot make it out of leather or anything like that. And that's kind of a problem with the mail, and it means that if you only have like leather, you can actually make a lamellar armor. And even if you make it out of steel, it is still relatively easy to make compared to other armors. For example, a plate armor needs massive big plates, which are going to be very hard to make, especially if you don't have the right technology to do it. And something like a mail armor, well, you don't need to make so large plates, but a mail shirt like this one has like 30,000 rings. So it's going to be incredibly time consuming to rivet all these rings, and it's going to take an eternity. A lamellar armor is kind of in between because it does not need massive plates, yet it doesn't have too many plates which make them too long to make. So you can actually make one of these armors relatively easily and relatively fast. So now we can start answering the question, why was it more popular in the East than in the West? Well, if we look at the different advantages, we can see that first of all, it can be made out of any material, meaning that if you don't have access to different metals, or you don't have the time to start building mines or something like that, you can actually still make an armor out of leather or rawhide or something like that. That is going to be relatively efficient. Obviously, it's not going to be as efficient as any other sort of metal armor because it's not metal, but it's still going to be relatively efficient. And lamellar armor is probably one of the best options for leather armors because it is overlapping enough to have a decent protection, and it's still simpler to make than some other sorts of armors. So for some like nomadic Mongolian tribes, something like that, that don't necessarily have the time to start making a mine on a specific place, it can actually be really useful to have lamellar because you can have leather lamellar armors that are still going to be pretty good, but that you don't need metal to make. And from there you have sort of an influence from the leather armor to the metal armor, because the metal that you are going to use to make armor, well, you already know how to make a leather lamellar, you use that armor, so you're most probably just going to make a lamellar armor out of that metal. Not only that, but you can also combine metal and leather in one suit of armor on lamellar. So for example, I could have this one armor here in metal, and then I could have leather lamellar for the legs or something like that. I could combine leather with metal to get a good suit of armor. Then you also have the fact that most Eastern cultures are usually going to be more focused around bows and arrows, more focused around archers. And as I said, the problem with mail is that it isn't too good at stopping arrows. It can still stop some arrows, especially from lighter bows, of course, but once you're running into some higher poundage bows, it is going to be worse at stopping them. A lamellar armor can most probably stop basically any poundage of bow, even up to poundages like 200 pounds, something like that. It's still going to have a good effect, most probably. Of course, I guess like an arrow shot from a 200-pound bow will be able to pass a lamellar with relative ease, but it's not going to stick out too far back, so you might survive it even though you get shot by like a 200-pound bow. So since the lamellar armor is better to protect against arrows, it kind of makes sense for cultures that are more focused around archers to use them. Then you also have the fact that generally speaking, using a lamellar armor for an archer is more practical. This one in particular, maybe not, because it has these shoulder guard that can be practical to move your arms around. Even though it's not too bad, I can perfectly well move my arms around perfectly fine. But especially if you have a lamellar armor without these extra shoulder guards, it is going to be very practical to use for archers because it's only protecting the torso. A mail armor usually has sleeves and stuff like that can be practical. Of course, you could make that armor without the sleeves, but then one of the main points of the mail armor is kind of gone, which is the fact that it is good at protecting gaps. If you have a mail armor that protect the same area as lamellar armor, then the mail armor is kind of useless. Then you also have the fact that lamellar armor is, generally speaking, slightly better for cavalry than mail, because it stops at the waist, so you have much more free movement with your legs, and you can actually sit on a horse with your legs bent more easily. And when you're like sitting on a horse, you're also kind of pushing it a little bit up, so it's more resting on your waist instead of resting on your shoulder, so the weight distribution is a little bit better than on something like mail that will, because of flexibility, sit a lot on your shoulders. Now, obviously, there isn't a lot of difference, but it can be slightly better for cavalry. And then, of course, it's also much better for horse archers, because that's a combination of archer and cavalry, so having that flexibility with your arms while still having good protection for the torso can actually be really useful for those mounted archers. Now, the main reason I would say is that in Western Europe, people relied mostly on shields to protect themselves from arrows, but also in melee, generally speaking. And the fact is that you don't need such a good armor that is not going to get pierced by anything when you have a shield that will stop everything in any case. And the fact is that you don't need a Lamellar armor that will stop any arrow because you have a shield, so the arrows are never going to come close to your body in any case. So having that bit more durable and a bit more flexible armor can actually be more useful when you have a shield. In the East, they, in a certain way, used the Lamellar armor instead of a shield. Because as you'll probably have noticed, usually, like, samurais don't use shields, Mongolian horse archers don't use shields. Shields are just less common, generally speaking, in the East, partly because they are using more bows, so using a shield can be impractical, and that can be a reason to use an armor that will stop more blows, because you actually need that, because different blows are actually going to hit you more easily because you don't have a shield. And since most of those blows are going to be arrows that have a chance to pierce mail isn't the best option, so actually having a Lamellar is better. Now, obviously, the Lamellar still has the problem that it has a lot of gaps, so an arrow can theoretically hit one of those gaps and actually just kill you even because it didn't hit the armor, but you're still unlikely to get hit in those gaps by an arrow or something like that. The Lamellar still protects the main areas of your body, and primarily it protects the most vulnerable parts of your body, the most important place to protect. And obviously you can combine it with mail that will protect those gaps. So the primary reason why Lamellar became popular and stayed popular was because people were more focused around archers, more focused around cavalry, and preferred using an armor instead of using a shield. And that led them to actually need an armor that was going to protect them against the arrows of the enemy archers, and that still was practical for your own archers. And a Lamellar armor is relatively practical to shoot a bow with, because you have a free movement with your arms like this. A mail armor, especially if it has sleeves, is going to add a lot of weight on those sleeves, and it's going to make it more impractical. Now, obviously, a big reason why the Lamellar never spread to the West was because people already had their own armors in the West, and starting to change your armors is going to change your whole infrastructure for making armor, which can be very complicated. For example, the Roman Empire, well, they already had mail, they already had scale. Now, maybe the Lamellar might have been a better option for them than something like the scale armor. But starting to change your entire infrastructure to another armor will be incredibly complicated, because, well, they already have blacksmiths and armorsmiths experienced in making scale armor, for example, or something like laminated armor, locus segmentata, and they are already making rivets, they're already making the plates they need. So even though we admit that the Lamellar was better for them, which isn't necessarily the case, but let's admit it was the case, starting to train all these smiths, starting to develop new techniques to make Lamellar armor is going to be very complicated and not necessarily worth it, even though you might get a better armor. And if we move forward in time to something like the early Middle Ages, people already had mail, which was more than enough to protect themselves, especially with their style of fighting, with the shield and so on. And even if the Lamellar could have been an improvement, which it didn't necessarily was, because of, well, they already had shields, didn't necessarily need that. It might only have added weight, so it might not really be useful. But let's admit, if it was an improvement, they have the problem that they already know how to make mail. They already have all the technology to make mail. So actually starting to adopt a new sort of armor will mean that now they need to know how to make these small plates. They need to change their techniques to make these small plates in mass instead of rings. So it's going to be much, much harder, and there's going to be a huge change in the infrastructure itself, which isn't necessarily worth it to get an armor that might potentially be a little bit better. And it didn't necessarily, and it wasn't necessarily, because it wasn't really adapted to the Western fighting style. And when like Western Europe started using like plate armors like Coat of Plate and Brigandine, you might imagine that, well, they could have started using Lamellar. The problem is that they were more used to making rivets and not lasers, and their original thought was to put plates on top of mail to give an extra protection over the mail. It wasn't to make a completely new armor on its own to put over the mail. So in the end, Lamellar was probably popular in the East because it was more adapted to the fighting style, being more archers and more cavalry, and also probably the fighting style evolved with the Lamellar since they had an armor that was good enough to stop most arrows. They didn't need the shield, so they could have more archers and so on. And the reason why it never spread to the West was because it wasn't really necessary, because people already had shields to stop those arrows, so they didn't need an Lamellar that was better stopping the arrows, and also they were less focused on archers and cavalry as a general rule, so Lamellar wasn't so important. And also there was that manufacturing part where if you're already used to making Lamellar, you're going to make more Lamellars, and if you are used to making another armor, you can keep making that other armor instead of adopting another one that will be way harder to make for you when you're not used to making that armor. So really, the Lamellar wasn't necessarily adapted to a more Western fighting style, and also it wasn't worth changing to it, even though it could have been better. And the same way, the Far East didn't change to something like mail because it wasn't really adapted to their fighting style or worth it to start making a new armor. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.